Justin is a university senior lecturer in the study of religion at the University of Cambridge, and he's written quite extensively on encounters between early Quakers and Islam, and now he's turned his attention, I'm glad to say, to encounters with early Unitarians and Islam. And Justin is himself a Quaker. So we welcome you, Justin.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and it really is marvellous to see so many people engaged in this activity. As was mentioned, I am a Quaker, so thank you very much for having me here. I should say I was married in a Unitarian chapel, though, and I have lots of Unitarian connections. That's why I'm here. What I'm going to talk about now, some of you, your heart may have sunk at something that sounded rather dry and inconsequential in the sense it was all about the past. But I hope, after I've finished it, when we get questions, I'll be able to perhaps open up rather more of the relevance of this particular story that I'm going to look at. It really is fascinating, the subject, and when I was asked to contribute, I discovered that this is something that, frankly, I could spend years and years and years doing, so it really has been incredibly enjoyable. I have made a slight change. The title now is Early Unitarians and Islam, academic : revisiting a primary document. All will become apparent in a moment. This paper is primarily concerned with a meeting that never happened and a letter that was never delivered. On the face of it, hardly a promising subject for a conference like this. Sometime in the summer of 1682, just as a Moroccan ambassador was about to leave for home after a lengthy and successful visit to England, some Unitarians in London attempted to deliver a bundle of papers to him. On hearing that they were concerned with religious matters, he declined to accept them. And so, unread, they passed into the hands of the Master of Ceremonies, Sir Charles Cotterell, and from him to a Church of England priest, Thomas Tennyson. And when, over a decade later, Tennyson became Archbishop of Canterbury, they found their way into the holdings of the Library of Lambeth Palace, where they can still be consulted today. They rarely are. Indeed, much of what the Unitarians tried to present remains in the Latin in which the bulk of the material was originally composed. Although a few scholars have in recent years discussed this curious case, quote from one of them, largely in passing, and the occasional work of contemporary Unitarian literature does make reference to it, the incident is largely neglected. Actually, do you mind if I do a quick show of hands? Who knew about this particular incident? Thank you. Thank you, because it does crop up in some sort of introductions and such like, but it's not, thank you, so I can now add the rest of my sentence, and almost entirely forgotten. Oh, I think it was about 10, I think. But I did try this out on a Unitarian minister who remained nameless, and he'd never heard of it, so there you go. There you go. But there are good grounds for believing that it is far from inconsequential. For example, Alexander Gordon, the great Unitarian historiographer, could claim that the covering letter, entitled the Epistle Dedicatory, which I'm going to call it that accompanied 3 longer treatises as part of the Unitarian submission to the ambassador, should be called the primary document of Unitarianism. Because it was the first time, so far as is known, this is quoting him, the term Unitarian was employed in an English document. More specifically, it employed the Unitarian name in its broadest scope, as denoting all who believe in an only sovereign God who hath no distinction or plurality in persons. For Gordon, it marked the beginning of a stage when Unitarianism became a comprehensive school of thought, and it transitioned from the, quote, sporadic anti-Trinitarianism of preceding centuries, laying the foundations for the eventual emergence of the Unitarian denomination in the British Isles. Although Gordon was, in one sense, wrong, the term Unitarian had been used almost a decade earlier in a comparable manner in a publication by the self-confessed Unitarian Henry Hedworth. Oh, by the way, in that particular document, he has an extensive section where he complains about women preachers. Sorry. The mere fact that he valued the text, this is Gordon, valued the text so highly justifies re-examining it today. Though, as I hope will become evident, there are many other grounds for thinking again about this unusual document. There are a number of ways that the epistle dedicatory could be scrutinised, but for now I would like to restrict myself to what can be gleaned by reading it within what we know of the wider context of early Unitarian interpretations of Islam. I was going to say there's about another 10,000 words, which includes the history of its reception, including the way Joseph Priestley got involved in its reception, but that'll have to be for another day and another paper. You can always ask about that. I want to look at the context of early Unitarian interpretations of Islam. But before doing this, it's important to give a brief summary of the letter's contents. So after some initial flattering remarks about the ambassador, the letter begins by the authors identifying themselves as belonging to, quote, the sect of Christians called Unitarians, and congratulating the ambassador and his retinue for being fellow worshippers of that sole supreme deity of the Almighty Father and Creator. And, unlike Christians in the, quote, western part of the world, preserving, quote, the excellent knowledge of that truth touching a belief on an only sovereign God who hath no distinction or plurality in persons. The ambassador is then informed of the letter of Ahmet ben Abdallah, the Latin text of which they tell him they have included as the second document in their collection. Now, that is a work that expounds Islamic beliefs, defends them, and criticizes the faith of both Catholics and Protestants. It was a letter written by a Spanish Moor who was defending his faith when grilled by a Catholic and Protestant royalty. However, the authors complain that such errors, the errors that this pointed out in this document by this other Muslim, we Unitarians do abhor as well as the Mohammedans. And I just want to say that the word Mohammedan is going to appear all over the place because obviously that's the term that was at the time, it's common, in which we must agree in such even against our fellow Christians. And so they have felt the need to write two further treatises in which they claim, first, to set forth in what points all Christians do generally agree with Mohammedans in matters of religion. Secondly, in what things Christians universally disagree from you with the reasons for the same. Thirdly, in what cases you do justly dissent from the Roman Catholics. Fourthly, the Protestant Christians do join with you in your condemning of the Romish errors and theirs and our reasons for the same. Fifthly, in what articles we, the Unitarian Christians, do solely concur with you Mohammedans. And in sixth place, undertake to discover unto you those weak places that are found in the platform of your religion and to offer for your consideration some materials to repair them. The rest of this initial letter consists of the anonymous authors who describe themselves as two single philosophers and orators of the Unitarians, claiming that they speak on behalf of a great and considerable people, making a case for the antiquity of their form of Christianity and its distinction from, quote, those backsliding Christians named Trinitarians, and explaining that although plentiful elsewhere, in the West, quote, in the West and the North, we are not so numerous by reason of the inhumanity of the clergy. They conclude the letter with an offer to visit Morocco to discuss its contents with the learned of your country. As perhaps is already apparent, the epistle includes a strikingly positive estimation of Islam in relation to Christianity. The writers evidently had a high estimation of the faith of Muslims. Indeed, they include them at the end of a list of Christian churches that, quote, maintain with us the faith of the one sovereign God, saying, and why should I forget to add you Mohammedans? They also have a high estimation of Muhammad as someone who was raised up by God as a, quote, scourge of the idolizing Christians, of the Trinitarians, and whom they seem to accept as a preacher of the gospel of Christ. I'm quoting bits from the document where they say that. Indeed, so exalted is their estimation of him that they cannot believe that he is responsible for the many, quote, and frequent repugnancies as are to be seen in those writings and laws that are nowadays given out under his name, end quote. It should be noted that despite what is said in the epistle dedicatory, the Unitarian treatises, the longer Latin treatises, do not systematically address the topics enumerated. Indeed, some are barely touched upon. For example, there is only one occasion where an interpolation in the Quran is identified and the grounds for judging it to be so are explained. The text discussed, for those who are interested, is Surah 4, verse 157, which concerns the Quranic claim that Jesus only seemed to be crucified. The two Latin Unitarian treatises are far from polished and were clearly written in a rush. As the authors say, they have 10 times more to urge on the same subject that we present, and that the papers that they are presenting are the work of only a few days. It still amounts to, there's about 80 or 90 pages of manuscripts. There's quite a bit, so they obviously had a lot more, but they did submit quite a lot. Okay, the context. In order to make sense of the letter, it's helpful to understand something of the relationship between early Unitarians and Islam that this letter both reflects and also develops and departs from. On the one hand, early Unitarians regularly found themselves described as being virtually synonymous with Muslims, as, quote, more Mohammedan than Christian. The Rakovian Catechism was dismissed as the Rakovian Al-Quran, so I'm quoting various anti-Unitarian writers. An important anti-Trinitarian writing, Arthur Berry's Naked Gospel, 1690, could be accused by one critic of being so similar to the Quran that it amounted to no more than a commentary on the text. There was a clear attempt to associate this form of dissent with a religion that was largely viewed at this time in England as a work of imposture, something dangerously alluring but blasphemous and diabolical. And given the dominance of the Ottoman Empire and its anxiety about the depredations of Barbary slavers, who at the time were even taking people from Cornwall and Southern Ireland, a religion that was physically threatening. To get some sense of the nature of the dominant hostile discourse concerning Islam and Muslims in this period in England, one need only read the needful caveat that accompanied the first English translation of the Quran, which appeared in 1649, which is also the year that Charles I had his head chopped off, interestingly. In it, the reader is told that the Quran is made up of 1, contradictions, 2, blasphemies, 3, of ridiculous fables, and 4, of lies. Or just the title of one of the first books in Arabic translated into English William Bedwell's Muhammad Impostor, that is, a discovery of the manifold forgeries, falsehoods, and horrible impieties of the blasphemous seducer Muhammad, with a demonstration of the insufficiencies of his law contained in the cursed Al-Quran. Or take a cursory look at one of the numerous captivity narratives that were a very popular form of literature at the time, recounted being a slave in North Africa. It's a common experience for English sailors. Given the widespread hostility towards Islam, it was a damning association to make, to associate Unitarians with Islam. Some evidence of this is seen in the accusation by Charles Leslie that the only reasons Socinians do not openly acknowledge Muhammad as one of their fathers is because the people would stone you, for they all have a great aversion to Muhammad. In some ways, this was a continuation of a long tradition of orthodox polemic against anti-Trinitarians that went back at least as far as Servetus, as well as the early years of the Transylvanian Unitarian movement, as opponents sought to deny their Christian status and claimed that they preached, quote, a Turkish Christ. It was not something exclusive to Unitarians. Such accusations could be made of other dissenters too. Quakers, for example, were regularly accused or talked about in a similar way. And Unitarians could find themselves being accused of being Jews, pagans, atheists, papists, as well as Muslims. But the accusation that they were really Muslims, or, quote, much more Mohammedans than Christians, was extremely common in relation to Unitarians, and much more so than any other group. Such language reflected the common assumption, found even on occasions when Unitarians were not the targets of polemic, that anti-Trinitarian Christianity had a strong affinity with Islam. Indeed, somewhat later, we can find Gibbon using the term Unitarian in Volume 3 of his famous The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire to refer to Muhammad, picking up on language that could be found at the beginning of the 18th century, if not before. That is, Muslims just being referred to as Unitarians, just as Unitarians are being referred to as Muslims. Indeed, as the authors of the Epistle Dedicatory had noted, Socinianism had thrived under Islamic rule. And rather than this being evidence of the intolerance of Trinitarians, as the letter and other Unitarian literature claimed, their critics saw it as conclusive proof that Unitarians were Muslims in all but name. For its opponents, Socinianism was virtually indistinguishable from Islam. The differences were imperceptible. However, even more concerning, it was claimed that Unitarianism makes way for Mohammedanism, quote, that Unitarianism inevitably led from Christianity to Islam. As Thomas Calvert remarked, if any Christians turn Mohammedans, they begin with Arianism and Socinianism, and then Turkism is not such a strange thing. And as conclusive proof of this, famous converts from anti-Trinitarianism to Islam were paraded as proof. Yes. Notably Adam Nusser and Paul Alciat. Although actually it was only true of the former. Paul Alciat lived out his days as a Socinian. But the former, Adam Nusser, was a prominent Reformed Protestant theologian from Heidelberg who preached anti-Trinitarianism. He managed to escape and make his way to the Ottoman Empire. Other anti-Trinitarians in Heidelberg put to death. So it is true in his case. When he got to the Ottoman Empire, he converted to Islam. Such a perception does not seem to have been one held solely by Trinitarian Christians, as it seems Ottoman Muslims express much the same view. Leibniz, for example, recounted reading about how a Turk, on hearing a Polish Socinian talk about his faith, wondered why he did not get circumcised and become a Muslim. Indeed, Socinianism was often described as even worse than Islam from the perspective of Orthodox Christians. Although both made use of similar arguments against the Trinity, theologically, Unitarianism could be judged as even more inadequate in its understanding, from an Orthodox perspective, in its understandings of such things as Christology or predestination. As Whitaker put it in his The Origin of Arianism, written towards the end of the 18th century, the truth is that even Muhammad himself, weak and wicked as he was, never ventured out into the high blasphemies of Socinianism. It was also thought worse because it was potentially more dangerous than Islam, causing Christianity to be destroyed from within. But it's also important to note that although claims about the affinities between Unitarianism and Islam were intended to be damning, they were not always understood that way by Unitarians themselves. Although some could be enraged by the association with Islam, William Freck, for example, was happy to praise Muhammad and the Quran for defending the unity of God against the errors of Trinitarian Christians. And Stephen Nye, these are early Unitarian thinkers, could talk favourably about Muhammad as someone who set out, quote, to restore the belief of the unity of God, which at that time was extirpated among the Eastern Christians by the doctrines of the Trinity and the Incarnation. Muhammad meant not his religion should be esteemed a new religion, but only the restitution of the true intent of the Christian religion. Berry could say that Muhammad professed all the articles of the Christian faith. Indeed, as some of their critics accurately observed, founding figures within Socinianism more generally have been happy to both acknowledge that the Quran contained the same message of the unity of God that they proclaimed, and to make use of the Quran to support their case. Francis David, for example, used the Quran to support his non-adorationist understanding of Jesus. And both Servetus and Aquinas made some use of it too. As the Unitarian historiographer of the Polish Radical Reformation, Stanisław Lubinecki, could say of Servetus, he sucked honey even out of the very thistles of the Quran in arriving at his doctrine. And in Servetus's famous trial in Geneva in 1553, he had to defend his use of the Quran to support his theological thought. Lacroze, the French critic of Socinianism, could claim with some justification that Unitarians, in the infancy of their sect, cited the Al-Quran as one of the classic books of their religion, even if later followers were rather more reticent about acknowledging this debt. The epistle dedicatory clearly reflects the major tropes that characterize the relationship between Unitarianism and Islam as understood by the early Unitarians. It is, in most respects, not innovative, but rather representative of early Unitarian views, notably in the manner in which it identifies fundamental commonalities between the two religions, embracing rather than rejecting something central to anti-Unitarian polemic. It was, however, clearly different from them in some significant respects. Firstly, much anti-Trinitarian writing, whilst praising elements of Islamic belief and practice, nonetheless repeated age-old calumnies against Muhammad. Berry, for example, despite his positive appraisal of Muhammad as a reformer who restored the true Christian gospel, could call him a, quote, lewd, brain-sick scoundrel, and his doctrines, as far as they are his, no better than extravagant whimsies or lewd panders to lust. Now, that's all, it might just sound generally offensive, but actually it reflects, if you look at the images of Muhammad in 16th century, 17th century England, and that this is very common to say that the Quran was a result of Muhammad's epilepsy, or that he made up verses just to further his own sort of sexual desires and things. So these kinds of accusations that Berry's using here are very typical of mainstream, not all, but mainstream discourse about Islam in England in the 17th century. The difference is the epistle dedicatory contains no such slanders, and Muhammad is praised as a man of judgment, and as we have noted, a preacher of the gospel of Christ. And so that is very different. Secondly, the treatment of Muhammad and Islam found in the epistle dedicatory was unusual in being so sustained. Most other anti-Trinitarian writings, especially English ones, only touched on the subject of Islam briefly. And I should just add, because we're focusing on this topic, and some of the literature, for those who look at the printed version of this, that are secondary literature, will also focus on this topic. We can sometimes, of course, end up rather exaggerating its significance within certain texts, and we don't list the texts in which Islam does not appear at all, and this sort of thing. So it's unusual to have a document that actually addresses and gives a sustained treatment. The only exceptions, other than the epistle dedicatory, I would say to this, Henry Stubbs' The Original and Progress of Mohammedanism, that's its original title, 1671, in which Trinitarian Christianity is dismissed as hopelessly corrupt and false in favour of Islam, which is represented as the religion of Christ and the Apostles, and also John Tolland's Nazarenus, or Jewish, Gentile, and Mohammedan Christianity. But neither of those were Unitarians, even though they were anti-Trinitarian. Thirdly, the epistle dedicatory was also distinctive in the audience that it addressed. Anti-Trinitarian texts that mention Islam are almost invariably written to other Christians. The only other notable exception to this is Adam News's famous letter to Sultan Selim II in 1570, and possibly some works by Jacob Palaiologos. The positive valuation, fourthly, the positive valuation of Islam, combined with the critical approach towards Islamic texts within the letter, is also noteworthy, if not exceptional. The fact that Unitarians were acting in the same way in respect to both the Bible and the Quran was something that even their opponents thought worthy of note, and clearly set them apart from the likes of Henry Stubbs. It is especially interesting that de Versay, who was the agent who delivered the Unitarian documents, he's named in some notes that Tennyson wrote on the manuscripts that are now in Lambeth Library. So this figure de Versay, who's described as the agent of the Unitarians, and may possibly have been one of the people who composed the epistle dedicatory, was himself the translator into Latin of Richard Simon's very important work on the history of the criticism of the Old Testament, which is crucial for anybody who studied biblical studies in the beginning of kind of critical compositional theory of the Old Testament. And he was somebody who himself had a reputation as, by the way, a Socinian, but also as a radical biblical critic. So we see the coming together of this criticism of the Quran using tools that were used on the Bible, which is really quite exceptional. But in conclusion, there is much more that can be said. Clearly, the epistle dedicatory does merit close scrutiny. However, I'd like to leave you with some observations on examining this text. As we have noted, Gordon was technically wrong to call the epistle dedicatory the primary document of Unitarianism. Indeed, a cursory examination of the reception of the text shows that this was not one embraced by Unitarians for most of their history. In fact, they seem to have been reticent about being associated with it. Rather, it was a text which was published, and published quite regularly, by their opponents, starting in 1708 with somebody called Charles Leslie, who I've mentioned. But it continues, and that's where Priestley has to deal with it, etc., in later generations. However, it would be hard to say that the epistle dedicatory did not deserve a place in any reasonable narrative of Unitarian origins. Surely, at the very least, McLaughlin was right to say that it expresses the growth of a new self-consciousness within Unitarians. That if that is the case, in the light of the above, we need to recognize how exceptional it really is. And so, by implication, how exceptional is the story of the birth of Unitarianism. I cannot think of any other example of the genesis of a major, at least at the time, Christian movement in which Islam, or indeed any other non-Christian religion, was a central defining interlocutor, other than the birth of early Christian church itself. Although even then the parallel breaks down, as Christianity was initially a messianic sect within Judaism, and it took some time for the so-called parting of the ways to run its course. At the very least, the story of the origins of early English Unitarianism is not solely one of intra-Christian struggles, of arguments about reason and scripture, or rather not solely Christian scripture. And finally, given the audience, I think I should conclude by saying that I imagine the epistle dedicatory is a far from easy text for modern Unitarian readers. Its presuppositions about God, Christianity, are not central to the lived religion of many contemporary adherents of the denomination, as I understand it. The notion that other religions, let alone their sacred texts, have weaknesses that Unitarians can repair might seem a little insensitive at best. And it is important to note that despite the positive language about Muhammad and the emphasis upon the commonality of belief between Muslims and Unitarians, ultimately the authors of the epistle dedicatory intended to convert the ambassador and his compatriots to Unitarian Christianity. Again, probably not something that sits comfortably amongst many contemporary Unitarians, given their liberal religious sensibilities. But however the epistle dedicatory is judged today, however awkward this heritage might be, it does show how innovative, bold, and disturbing radical dissent can be, and how it can envisage relationships and commonalities that go beyond the limits of prevailing thinkings and practices. In that sense, and in many others, it is a remarkable document, if not the primary document of Unitarianism.